Welcome to the Bad Boss Brief, a strategic guide on how to not be an asshole at work. We'll tell you about bad bosses, how they can be handled, how to tell if you happen to be one. An executive and an executive coach, both artists working in advertising and marketing for more than 2 decades, are here to advise you on the ins and outs of office environments. The Bad Boss Brief is your ultimate guide to navigating any employment landscape. Without any further ado, here are your hosts, Eugene S. Robinson and Stephanie Peirolo.
There we go.
Hey, I'm Stephanie Peirolo.
I'm Eugene S. Robinson. I forgot I had a momentary lapse who I was.
This is the Bad Boss Brief. Today, we're going to talk about the addicted boss. We're going to talk about addiction at work. And when I speak of addiction, I mean alcoholism, addiction, the whole 9 yards. And I have certainly worked with and for people who are addicted to drugs and alcohol. But I want to say up front that my perspective is also influenced by the fact that I am a recovering alcoholic. I've been sober for a long time. And I believe 2 things about alcoholism and addiction. The first thing is that it's a disease, right? And you can't talk someone out of a disease. They can't promise you that they won't be sick. And the second thing is that addiction is a disease that impacts all of the people around the addict or alcoholic, right? So obviously, if your loved one has cancer or diabetes, you're impacted, but they won't be stealing your car. So I guess I want to start with that because some people think that the disease model is a cop-out, or it can be. What do you think? I mean, people use alcoholism as addiction as an excuse for bad behavior. Do you think it's a disease?
Well, the closest thing I've been able to come is sex addiction. And people don't take you seriously if you talk about sex addiction. But no, I believe it is actually a disease. Having had people close to me in my life who have been affected, and you don't realize that until you see, or it's going to sound weird and pejorative, until you see a real alcoholic. Like I had a friend, and I never put it together. Like, yeah, the person likes to drink, until I saw him in action, and it was like a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde thing. And one beer was not even in the realm of possibilities. Once he had that one during the course of an evening, I watched him drink every single one that was in the house that was meant for other people. And I tried to stop him. I'm like, hey, kind of gentle. But after that first one, he wasn't even able to hear. And I was like, okay, I got you. It's a disease,
Right. And it's especially challenging when you're working for
Yes.
or with an addict or alcoholic. I had a situation where I was working in an ad agency, and the senior creative person, who was very talented, was, well, I mean, it's not mine to judge, but every day at lunch, he would go out and he would smoke marijuana in the parking lot. And this was a long time ago. It wasn't legal anywhere. And he would come in and he would be great to work with. He'd be all smiles, helpful, collaborative, wonderful. Then the next morning, he'd come in the morning and he would be angry, probably hungover or something. And he would be just, it was Jekyll and Hyde. And he was so horrible until noon when he'd go outside, he literally stood behind the building, got high, and then came in wreathed in smiles. And I remember talking to the big boss and saying, look, everybody knows this, including the big boss. It's terrible for morale that he gets to spend half the day being a horrible person to everyone. You need to deal with this. But the big boss didn't want to mess with it because this guy was a creative. He was talented. I think there's sort of a myth that, well, creatives are going to be alcoholics and addicts. It's part of their mysterious genius. I also think it's not an accident that both of these people were white men.
Well, also, we're still talking business. I mean, I had a guy who worked for me, a creative, and he was having a problem with crystal meth, which redounded to him working 23-hour days. He goes to his boss and says, listen, I'm having a problem with crystal meth right now. And his boss looks at him and says, if money's a problem, you see, the boss didn't give a shit. As long as this guy was willing to work 23 hours a day, whatever he put in his system was fine with that boss. So, the guy says, oh, well, we don't know. We don't really want to interfere. I think, if the guy's not producing and doing that, maybe they interfere. As long as he's producing, this is not a friendly system, this capitalism sometimes.
That is true. I think probably most of the time. So,
Yeah.
one of the things is if you have a boss who is an addict, what should you do? And I kind of outlined two paths, right? The first path is if you're working with someone who's an alcoholic or an addict and you have power, then you're going to want to set some consequences for them, right? So don't be like the people that we've talked about and just ignore it. Go to HR. You also want to make sure that you are aware of the legal ramifications. Some HR people know, the number for a good employment lawyer. Some don't. This is definitely one where you want to get the legal perspective in your state or jurisdiction. But I think you should set some consequences. And I think another key thing is that people forget there's a saying that like an alcoholic will steal your wallet and an addict will steal your wallet and help you look for it. And, I think, and I say this as a person in recovery, right? We're not known for our truth telling, right? So if you do have somebody who has a problem, don't believe anything that they're saying, right? Don't believe them when they say they're going to quit. Don't believe them when they say it's just a weird interaction with their antibiotics. Just don't believe them, right? And continue to take the action. The other thing that's interesting is that, so Alcoholics Anonymous started in this country many, many years ago. And there is a kind of an idea that the way to get sober has to be in a 12-step program and it has to be total abstinence. And the reality is that, evidence-based medical treatments for alcoholism and addiction have come a lot farther, right? So in the early days when AA was started, there was nothing else, right? It was like, you're going to die, end up in an institution or end up in jail. Now there's really effective medications where you get a medication and water and wine have the same impact on your body. And so I just, I think that we've seen so much in kind of culture on TV. Every TV show has some addict or alcoholic, and if they get sober, they're going to relapse. And they talk about sponsors and they talk about going to meetings, and that works for a lot of people, but it's not mandatory anymore.
Right. Hey, tell me, if I have a boss who's got a drug problem, can I call the police on him?
Well,
I'm just trying to think out of the box here.
Actually, though, you know what? Unfortunately, that's like the second part. If you are working with someone or working for someone who has a drug problem, you have to actually protect yourself from that, right? So like if you have that situation and you don't have power, then you need to be really careful. And one of the things to be careful about is don't ever get in a car with that person. Yep. And I'm not talking about drinking and driving, which of course, obviously you want to be mindful of not driving with someone who's impaired. But I know of women who have gone to a work event and gotten in the back of a taxi cab with their drunk male boss, and he has assaulted them.
Yeah.
So, and I think the challenge with alcoholism and addiction is, it's a disease where people pretend they don't have a disease, or they really believe they don't have a disease, and they can convince other people.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And I think it's hard because I think, especially women, we're taught to kind of, sometimes second guess ourselves. Yeah. And, I literally had somebody come into my house who was stinking of booze. Mm-hmm. And I was like, so you've been drinking? And she was like, no, it's this antibiotic that I take. It makes my breath smell like beer.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
And it's hard to see. And I think especially with drugs, I remember at college, we were there at the same time. There was a very robust cocaine culture that was happening. And I didn't do drugs at that time. Right. And I didn't know what it was. And I remember going to a concert and saying to my friend, Catherine, that guy's just he's very nervous. He seems like a very nervous guy. And she just looked at me.
Animated even.
Yeah, she just looked at me like he's a cocaine addict. But I think that's the trouble at work is that a lot of times people, particularly if they don't know about addiction, they can't tell because you can't smell oxy on somebody's breath, but they know that something's off. And so that's what I would recommend is like if you think something is going on, trust your gut and be careful.
This is what McGruff the crime dog says, right? And I've collected these horrible stories over the course of the years. For some reason, people tell me. And I remember a woman who is now a pretty serious executive, but who first job out of college gets there's a company offsite, a retreat, Boss offers to drive her, picks her up at her house, and they're driving to this retreat at a camping site, and then discovers that there's nobody else at the camping site but the two of them. There is an actual fact. Well, you're my executive assistant, so this is about team bonding, and of course, she was assaulted that night, and right out of college, decided to say nothing about it in order to, in furtherance of her career, which I thought was, but this was 35 years ago. These were different times for her. But yeah, you have to know that you are in an unstable place wherein anything could very possibly go. And the higher the person is up on the scale, I mean, clearly you're in the valley now with people microdosing. And is there a line between micro and macro sometimes when we're talking about psychoactives, which I strongly believe in the power of psychoactives in therapeutic settings. Screaming at me Monday morning, not a therapeutic setting. So,
well, and I think also it's the idea of it seems like people who microdose are like vegans. They can't stop talking about it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's one thing if they can microdose and they can seem to be functioning. That's one thing. But usually, I mean, aren't they talking about it quite a bit? Isn't that the point?
The ones I've known, of which there were two, they talked about it quite a bit. And of those two, one actually maintained, and the other just spun wildly out of control. And last I heard was living in a van. So. He would push off on this tendency to feel sorry for him. He structures it as, these were the choices I've made to live a more fulfilled existence. Okay.
Well, and I think that is, that's a really good point, because I think that, addicts and alcoholics will play on the emotions of the people around them. Right. Mm-hmm. And the challenge is that a lot of people will buy into that. Right. They'll buy into this, either he or she is such a genius or such an important part of the organization, I have to help them. But there's a lot of over-functioning, enabling, whatever you want to call it. And I find this particularly, again, with women, where they feel like, I need to protect the boss. I need to take care of the boss. I need to, fill in where he isn't able to do it. And we've all seen those circumstances, right? And I think the challenge is, and what I recommend is that a lot of times people don't get sober until they have an opportunity to savor the consequences of their choices. Right. And so, I know a lot of people who didn't get sober until they lost the job, they lost the wife, they lost the kids. And you have to allow people to have those experiences, and it can be hard. I think I might have lost you. You're frozen. Okay. Well, I guess that's the joy of doing a live podcast. So I'll just continue to talk until you come back and we'll try it again. So if you do work for someone who is an addict or an alcoholic, don't make excuses or cover up for them. But if you feel safe going to HR or any other sort of governing entity, then you should. And again, not only could you be doing the addict a favor, but you might be helping someone else. So keep in mind, if you work in healthcare, education, transportation, the stakes are a lot higher than if you work in advertising or technology. We don't want drunk doctors or pill popping pilots or a bus driver or a teacher. And so I think it's important to recognize that there are places where I believe, at least morally, people who see an alcoholic or an addict need to actually call that out. So, and then, another thing too is another sort of myth about alcoholism is that there are certain people who are alcoholics and addicts. The cozy, sweet 50-something kindergarten teacher couldn't possibly be an alcoholic. The nice parish priest couldn't possibly be addicted to drugs. And unfortunately, it's not something that discriminates. You can't tell by somebody's age or role in life that whether they are or are not having a problem with drugs and alcohol. Okay, so one of the other things that I think is interesting and that I want to kind of consider is, it's almost a PR cliche that a man slaps his wife in public or does something that's just terrible and awful. Oftentimes it's captured on video, it blows up on social media, and then he'll turn around and say, I'm going into treatment for alcoholism, or I have a drug problem. I'm going to, go into like a 30-day treatment center. And there's a lot of apologies. And I guess, one of the questions that I think is, do you forgive people who have made those kinds of mistakes in a very public way if it is related to drugs and alcoholism? And this would be what I would ask Eugene if he was here right now. But for listeners, I just invite you to kind of consider it, because I see it in two different ways. I think on the one hand, if a person is using alcoholism or addiction as an excuse for behavior which is horrible, then they should still be held to account for the behavior which is horrible. I mean, I'm a recovering alcoholic. I did a lot of stupid stuff when I was drunk, but I didn't ever hit someone. I didn't do anything that was fundamentally against my values. They say in vino veritas, which is the true person comes out when you're drunk. I don't think that that is necessarily an excuse, although there is the obvious example of people who do choose to drive drunk and who get in an accident and can kill someone, which, I know people that's happened to, sadly, and they should go to jail and they should suffer the consequences of that. And so I think I'm torn. I feel like if the thing that you did when you were under the influence was clearly reprehensible or illegal, your being intoxicated or in an altered state should not be a mitigating factor to you suffering the full consequences, legal, financial, and otherwise. However, I have known of circumstances where there was someone who had a drug problem. They were pretty senior in a company and they lost their job because of it. I mean, they were sent to treatment. There were some, I can't remember all the details, but then they got sober. And then the question is, can they be rehabilitated? At what point do they come back? Are they going to be given a second chance? Oh, there you are again. Hey.
There you are. Sorry. We can have June edit this.
We can. But I kept going for those of us, for the people that are
Good.
Live.
Good.
And I don't know if you could hear me or not, but what I was saying, could you hear what I was saying?
I could.
Okay. So I guess that would be my question. Like, at what point do you think that we say to somebody, hey, I believe that you're sober. We're going to give you a second chance, even though last time you did, something. How much grace should we give somebody who gets sober?
I have an associate who every time he started to hate his jobs, he would start drinking, and he was non-functional personally, but professionally was pretty, was on it, but it was miserable. And his bosses would say, "What do you need?" Look, he said, "I have a problem with alcohol," and they would let him go off to rehab. 8 months, he's got 80% of his salary. Take yoga, do whatever. And he would come back renewed, and he would repeat this anytime he had professional difficulties, by which I mean he got bored in his job. I'm not saying this was contrivance. I'm just saying that's traditionally kind of what happened. And he continued to do it until he got into a job that the first time he went through that routine, they said, okay, let him go 8 months into rehab. When he came back, they sat him down and said, what do you want to do? He was like, well, I'm just happy to be back. And they were like, don't give me that crap. In your dream scenario, what do you want to do? And he was like, he realized or thought that these are people who were genuinely interested in seeing him succeed. And he said, I want to stop being a software engineer and I want to start doing this. And they backed his play. They bought him a studio, made him head of, the studio, and gave him, a pretty significant budget. And he's done this now for 14 years and hasn't had a drink since. So, is he a man? Yes, he's a man. Is he white? Well, yes, he's white. Has this ever happened to me? No, it hasn't, but I don't have a drinking problem. So, I think I'm a firm believer in sort of professional second chances, but I don't see them being equally applied. So this is my concern. And rather than try to up-level the system, it seems like it makes more. It's weird that I'm arguing for this punitive thing, but it seems like since we're not going to up-level, at least let's get everybody punished equally. You know?
Right, and I think again, it really is giving people the opportunity to have the consequences of their choices. I mean, like we need to stop, and I think that goes beyond alcoholism or addiction. I think we need to have people have the consequences of their choices for sexism, for racism. I mean, it's, they should be held accountable. And I think the idea that there are some people who get to skate because of whatever their talent is should be stopped. Shall we do?
In interesting, because of the timeout, we could go a little bit over, I think. But in an interesting turnaround, there was another guy he worked with who watched this whole thing happen and was like, had a V8 moment. Was like, wow, I'm going to do this, and starts, and then his boss says, "Hey, Brian, can we talk for a minute? What's wrong?" And Brian goes, I got a problem with crystal meth. And they go, "Great, you're fired." So, and what Brian had miscalculated is that alcohol in America is legal. Crystal meth is not. So he made it very easy for them to say, "Yeah, you got a problem with illegal drugs. It's like you robbed a bank. We can't help you. We're not in the business of aiding and abetting criminality." So Brian sort of played himself. So.
Well, and I think too, I mean, the world in recovery circles is quite different than it used to be because of fentanyl. Mm-hmm. Right. And the challenge is now that there's a lot of people that felt like they could do the occasional, socially using heroin doesn't seem like it's a really successful strategy, but there are people who have tried it. And I know people who have tried it and died because their heroin was cut with fentanyl. And these were, these are not people who are living on the streets. These are, like pretty successful white collar workers. And suddenly you're getting the message that like, wow, this person went out to have a party night and it turned out they got some bad drugs. And so that's the thing too, to also keep in mind is if you call somebody on this for whatever reason, you are also potentially keeping them alive because more and more drugs are being cut by fentanyl. So do you want to do a fire me section?
Yeah. Well, I'd like to, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, I tell you, I'm going to bring up this guy he's now a two-time member of the Fire Me Club, because it boggles my mind that the instincts could have been so right for so long and so wrong just in that fast. That, like, I find it really disturbing. I'm talking about Mark Benioff this time, and I did want to debut that there are. I got my information about Microsoft. The launch of Microsoft was done, and I got more information about more layoffs coming up at Google, which I believe is also correct. I'm in the spirit of being not an ass. I will not mention a very specific division is coming in. So it just, because people not listening to the show for to have their lives upended, but it's coming, and I have very good information that's happening. But Benioff has said, they were really trying to fashion Salesforce as as your home away from home. We're your friends, we're your family, and apparently now in back channels, what he's trying to do is maybe Musk being Elon Musk, maybe Musk has a few things up his sleeve. Maybe we just need to tear the Band-Aid off quickly and do the layoffs, and people get their feelings hurt. They're going to get their feelings hurt anyway. Let's just let them get hurt and get on with business. And which I just find just so antithetical to your original mission. It reminds me of something that a high-ranking executive I had heard once said, and I was like, "Aren't you concerned about the attrition rate?" And they just kind of looked and shrugged, and they were like, people, it's fungible. It's a fungible resource. And I was like, of course a billionaire would think that. Of course a billionaire would think that. But I've met a few, and Andy Grove, as tough as he was, understood the real value, I think, of human resource, and would have been appalled had he heard that sentiment. Yeah, people do come and go, but how much do you have to spend training these people? How much do you have to spend, adjusting for crap morale? Crap morale is not a given. Doesn't have to be, but these guys are still freaked out over the failure to return to, 5 days a week of seeing people sitting at their desk when they walk through the office. And I don't think that's ever coming back. So.
Well, and I think, it actually ties to what you were saying earlier about capitalism and the way that people will, go keep using meth because you are much
Yep.
more productive. And I really do think that is the fundamental challenge, is that for all of the name checking during the, do you hear an echo?
No.
Okay, I don't know where that's coming from. Must just be me. During the pandemic, there were so many corporations that were bending over backwards to talk about wellness and we care about you. And they were sending out care packages, having meeting free Mondays, having mental health days, all of this stuff. And they're trying to perpetuate this myth that like we, the employers, care about you, the people that work for us, until we don't. And then
Yep.
we lay you all off, starting again, as we have referenced before, with the people who are in DEI, with people of color. And really this myth that corporations care for us it's a myth. And I think people are starting to look at it, and I think people are starting to think differently. I was talking to a young woman in her 20s about work, and she was saying that she and her friends are looking around after the pandemic and being like, I don't want to waste my life spending all of my time working for a soulless corporate entity.
Yeah.
And I don't think she's alone. And I think that with all of these layoffs, these corporate giants are saying, this is what we actually think of you.
Yeah.
And I think there's going to be a gap where the kids that are coming up behind us, they don't have mortgages yet. They don't have kids yet. They have a lot of flexibility, and they may just choose to opt out.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if you read this thing. It was on Twitter. This woman, it was in the Atlantic, I believe, and this woman was starting her maternity leave the day Musk took over. And of course, he came and just, within 7 days, she was jobless. And they just talked to, it's a sampling of the jobless, but of course, I'm taking note that this was a woman. The second person who was in the piece was an older woman. Says like, yeah, I'm in high tech, but I'm not a tech bro. I'm living month to month in an apartment in San Francisco. And if I didn't, given my age, if I can't get a follow-on gig, I'm going to have to leave. And given my age, I can't go home. There is no home for me to go to that, like, oh, if things didn't work out post-college, I can go back to. And you start to see, and of course the article was designed very much to give you the face of the human cost of reorganizations. But it's hard to reconcile that with this blathering billionaire who is not really could make massive mistakes like he has and still not suffer any real consequences. And my understanding, as part of the article, I thought was pretty compelling, that even when he goes to the toilet at Twitter, he has 2 bodyguards with him. And it's like, I'm glad you realize that you're a man who needs 2 bodyguards to take a leak, because you shouldn't miss the fact that there are real people living real lives behind all this stuff. And look, it could be me. I've said, when I wasn't a boss, when I'm a boss, I don't want to make these mistakes, but I've never been the level of a boss where multi-millions of people are relying on me, So maybe you have to make these tough decisions. Maybe you have to be an ass about it. There's a horrible quote that Heinrich Himmler once had, which was, a curse of a great man is to step over corpses. If I heard that from somebody who was at Goldman Sachs, and I'm a student of World War II history, and I had never heard that before until somebody at Goldman Sachs said, well, you know what Himmler said? I'm like, what? That gets your attention right away. He's like, the curse of a great man is to have to step over corpses. These guys are really thinking stuff like that. So I don't know. I don't know what a kinder, gentler kind of management of resource, human and otherwise, I don't know what that looks like, because we haven't seen a lot of it in America. Of course, people are doing stories about the folks at Patagonia who have made some really nice moves in terms of being good bosses. I think the temptation and the problem, if you're a biz school person, is that for every good Patagonia story that you hear of people like the crystal meth guy who's trying to game the system, which makes them go like, yeah, why am I being nice? These people are abusing me and using me. But, I prefer to think that they're good people all around us.
Well, and I think too, I have a friend who is an executive coach, and she's been in HR for many, many years, done many layoffs. And she was saying that she has done layoffs at really large corporations, and there is no excuse, no matter how many people that you're laying off, that you cannot speak directly to each person that is impacted There's no reason that, I mean, I'm thinking in my head, like, well, if you're laying off thousands and tens of thousands of people, maybe you do have to do it via email. She's like, absolutely not. That is a cop out. And I thought that was interesting because there clearly are systems where people can have a humane interaction at the end of their term of employment. And again, she gave some really good examples of like seeing that a layoff is coming, giving the people that are going to be impacted months of warning, giving them career counseling, trying to help them find other jobs, giving them just paying for their health insurance for a few months after they've been laid off. Because of course the problem is that almost all of us have health insurance that's based through our employer, which gives the employer so much power. And I think that there are ways to do it that are humane, and there have been organizations that have done that traditionally. And I think this is a new twist. And the idea is somehow, again, is it the tech companies that are too big to fail? We're smart and we're microdosing, and this is how we're going to do things now. But I think the fundamental thing is there's no excuse to treat human beings like chattel. And to not consider the impact on them and on their families when they're terminated, because you can very easily just say, I'm sorry, we're going to have to let you go. Here's your package. Here's a number to call somebody. And, we wish you the best. Do you have any questions? I mean, you can do that for thousands of people with the HR teams that you have. So they're making a choice.
Yeah, and I find it interesting that for those of us who have been divorced, in actual fact, if it's an uncontested a divorce in which people are fairly amicable, it still takes like 2 years. No fault divorce, it still takes like 2 years, and that's not without a lot of real estate financial holdings, but they're just statutory things that you have to go through with the courts, and things have to go through certain periods of time. And listen, people have a lot tied up in their marriages, real estate, assets, and so on. So you can't tell me that it's outside of the realm of business possibilities that also these layoffs should take some time. You shouldn't be able to walk into work on Friday and an hour later find out that you don't have health insurance, that that your maternity leave has been canceled and you are unemployed, and that you'll have to move at the age of 53, have to move out of your San Francisco apartment to fates unknown. I mean, come on.
Well, and they do this in other countries, right? I mean, I think we are unique, and I don't know not a lot about international law, but I do know working for an international company, if there were layoffs that were happening in Europe, it was an entirely different deal. Right? There was an entirely different set of statutes rather than the kind of Wild West scenario that we're dealing with here. That is unfortunate. And then I think that what's going to happen is people are going to start responding accordingly. And this whole notion of quiet quitting. Quiet quitting is just doing your job and not working overtime for free. And of course people are doing that, like the hand wringing of the quiet quitting. These young people are just not working as hard as we used to. It's like, and why should they?
There's a guy I know, his job was corporate spy, by which anytime there was a problem spot in the company, they would hire him into that spot to find out what the problem was, whether it was retention. So he was a fake employee, and at one point, one of the managers was so hated that the Vietnam expression was frag, that one of the employees had intended to frag him. And as he's leaving, it was a fabrication facility, as my friend who was this detective, who I'd written about actually before, as he's leaving the facility, he's on a catwalk in this big wafer fabrication, and he sees the hated supervisor and one of the employees with a brick stalking him through the facility. He can see this from his vantage point. And I said, well, what did you do? He goes, that guy was such a pox on the corporation. I just went home that night. I go, did the guy get hit? He goes, yeah, he got knocked out. I felt kind of bad. But when I filed my report, I said that this guy is clearly part of every single problem you have in your wafer fabrication. So at that point, the company was like, we got to get rid of him, but we can't get rid of him injured. And so they had to wait a bit. But they ultimately got rid of him. But I said, do you feel like it was a dereliction of your duty that you didn't stop somebody from getting hit with a brick? He was like, he wasn't a management guy, but had been hired to do a management job. In that instance, his true nature kind of took over. It was like, yeah, the guy was horrible. horrible to the people who worked for him, and nobody was stopping that guy. So,
well, and you know what's interesting is it's like, I mean, we talk about bad bosses, that's the whole point. But the idea that, we're talking about addicted bosses, there are people who are doing horrible, awful things, assaulting women, like all of the stone cold sober.
Yeah, correct.
And also facing no consequences.
Weirdest thing, first job out of college, a good friend of mine, she calls in sick. And she went to the doctor that day. And when she gets back to her apartment complex after having called in sick, her apartment manager comes looking worried and says, "Are you okay?" And she goes, "Yeah, I had to go to the hospital." Why? She goes, "Oh, your boss came by." She goes, "What?" Yeah, he asked me to let him into the apartment. So I figured her boss left the job, left the workspace, got into his car, drove over to her apartment complex, convinced the apartment manager to let him into her apartment, and since she says she's not there, calls her into the office when she comes in sick and says, "You would think he would conceal this." He says, "Is it, what does he say?" He goes, "Is it too much to keep your place clean?" Starts criticizing the quality of her housekeeping after having broken into her apartment. And I go, "What are you going to do?" She goes, I'm quitting.
That's one where you call the police.
Creepy. It was inappropriate.
Yeah, that's one where you call the police.
Clearly where you call the police. So, yeah,
right, I'm just gonna.
This was, we're talking the 80s. So
yes, the olden days. Although, all right, I'm going to end with one other.
Yes.
Yeah, the battle days. I'm going to end with one other suggestion, which is try not to center alcohol and drug consumption at work. I mean, I've worked in a lot of advertising agencies. They all had open bars. They all had a keg in the kitchen 24/7. Try not to do that. So that's the end. We'll be back. We would like to get some topic ideas, and you can send those to WTF at Bad Boss Brief. Thanks a lot.
That always gives me a laugh. I love that. WTF.
That was the point. All right. Bye, everybody.
Later.
Thank you for listening to the Bad Boss Brief with your hosts Eugene S. Robinson and Stephanie Peirolo. You can check out more of their work by visiting consigliera.substack.com for Stephanie and eugenesrobinson.substack.com for Eugene. You can also find Eugene at Mr. Sleep 3, that's the number 3, on Instagram. Send us your questions or comments to WTF@badbossbrief.com. And be sure to join us right here on your favorite podcast platform for more insights every other week. Until next time, don't be an asshole at work.